Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Johnson, and welcome to the latest episode of the True Claims Podcast, a fascinating case to tell you about today. In May of 2024, a woman named Tina was on a trail, and as she's walking the trail, she came across a bike path. She looked to her right. She heard a bell ringing. A woman on a bike went by her. She then started to cross the bike path, and then bam, she was hit from the other side by a bike going at a good rate of speed. She was hit hard. She went down. She hit her head on the asphalt, and that was just the beginning of a lot of problems for Tina. She had a traumatic brain injury. She spent 150 days in the hospital. They actually had to remove a chunk of her skull in one of several operations that she had to undergo. And after she left the hospital, that was just the beginning of the challenges that face this woman. At some point, the Davis Law Group got involved, and I want to bring in Chris Davis, the founder of the Davis Law Group, and you just feel for this woman. She's out for a walk, crossing a bike path, got hit hard. How did you guys get involved, Chris?
So we were first contacted by her husband. Tina was in the hospital, had been in the hospital for at least a week or so, and the injuries were very, very severe. In fact, there was one point where they didn't know if she was going to come through or not. But the husband contacted us and retained us, and right away we started our investigation.
Early in the investigation, you came across something that would be very, very important to this case, didn't you?
Yeah, so we in bicycle accident cases, a lot of the cyclists have a GPS unit on their bike that records their speed, their location, and the data is often uploaded to a common site that cyclists use to track where they've been and so forth. And we knew that before we were retained, but we immediately once we got the information about the cyclist GPS system, we used that, inputted it in the site, and discovered where he had been and how fast he had been traveling. And
how fast was he going? Because the speed limit where the woman was hit was 15 miles per hour, if I'm not mistaken. How fast was he going?
So what we were able to gather is about a half a mile before the incident, where the incident occurred, he was going more than 20 miles an hour. We know from the video of a nearby homeowner that he did not stop or slow down, we believe, before he struck Tina and caused her to hit her head on the pavement. But we had some powerful evidence to show that he had been exceeding the speed limit in other locations on that trail.
Let's talk about finding that security camera video. Hugely important, I'm guessing. Now you can actually see this thing happen in real time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why we have an in-house investigator. One of the first things he does is he will contact nearby businesses or homeowners to see if anybody had a camera that may have caught the incident. And we were lucky. There was a homeowner in that area that showed partially what happened, but definitely showed her being hit and then knocked to the ground.
And let's talk about that video, what you saw on that video. You can see her looking as that other cyclist goes by slowly, and then she takes that step out into the path.
Yeah, so she came down from the parking lot from stairs, which is a common entryway on that path, and looks to her right before stepping into the path. And then as she's looking left, she takes one step, and that immediately is when she is hit by the cyclist.
I mean, it happens bang, bang, doesn't it?
Very,
really
very quickly.
fast.
Yeah, very, very quickly. And could she have maybe hesitated another half a second? Perhaps. But when you look at the video and you see how hard she was hit, it's fairly clear that the cyclist was going way too fast for that area, which is common for pedestrians and cyclists.
And also compared to the woman who was in the other bicycle, you could see her going at a regular rate of speed.
Yes.
And so you have an idea, the eyeball does, of how fast she's going, and he was obviously going much faster.
Yeah, and notably that the woman on the bike that passes on her right, you can hear her ring her bell, which is a warning sign, which is part of the rules, the county's rules for cyclists using that trailway, is to alert pedestrians that may be in the area so that the pedestrian can, avoid a collision.
You did something interesting, and I've seen you do this many times, and I'm curious to ask you why and how it works for your client. You went to the media. You had this video, made it available. It shows up on local television newscasts. Right. What does that do for your case?
The videos are hugely important. They can make or break a case. Oftentimes when we get involved, especially with cycling and pedestrian accidents. It comes down to a he said, she said situation. And so we're left trying to prove that our client's version of what happened is true. So the video solves that problem. So that's one of the reasons why when we get into the case, one of the first things we do is we comb the area looking for surveillance footage.
And then going on the air, going to the news stations?
So we do that because, one, we're looking for other witnesses that may have seen what happened. Two, to bring attention to this issue, which is common among cyclists and pedestrians that are using a common trailway, as in this case. But mostly to to find witnesses that might have seen what happened so that our client's version can be, supported.
Let's talk a little bit about Tina. What can you tell me about her? Did she have a family?
Yeah, she had a family. She was married. She'd been married for, I want to say, over 30 years. I believe she had children, adults. She had a job. When she was injured, she slammed her head onto the pavement, which knocked her out cold. And the brain injury was severe enough where they performed a craniotomy, which is where they remove a portion of the skull because the brain is swelling from the trauma, right? So that's
relieve the pressure.
To relieve the pressure. And so there was a long period of time where she was without half of her skull, and so she had to wear a helmet as protection after she left the hospital.
Man alive. And how is she doing now? Can you tell us?
She's doing much better than the first 6 months or so, but she's going to have lifelong problems. She's going to require up to 24-hour care because of the extent of her brain injury, and that before we got involved or before the case resolved, that care was performed by her husband, who also had a full-time job. So you can imagine how the injury affected the entire family.
Yeah. Wow. And look, I'm guessing you don't get over something like this. I'm guessing this will impact her the rest of her life.
Yeah, it's a permanent injury. And fortunately, we were able to find enough insurance with the Cyclist to compensate her. A lot of times we get involved, there's no insurance. There's no recovery at all. But in her case, she was lucky in the sense of as far as how much we were able to recover on her behalf.
Before we get to the negotiation, I want to ask you about the burden. How much of the burden for safety is on a cyclist in a situation like this? How much is on the pedestrian? We've all been on these trails, I'm guessing, where cyclists fly by, right. And then we've all seen pedestrians that aren't paying attention at all. Yeah. So where does the burden lie? Well,
so both have an obligation under the law to act carefully and avoid collisions. So the cyclist has usually the greater burden because the cyclist is traveling faster. The cyclist is usually the one that hits the pedestrian, but the pedestrian also has an obligation to look and to avoid a collision if that can occur, if that can happen as well. So it comes down to balancing the two obligations, and that's going to depend on the facts of the case. So for instance, in this case, this was an area that the cyclist knew it had a lot more pedestrians than usual because of the crossing area. There were signs in the area that also alerted cyclists that there were pedestrians in the area. So we argued that the cyclists had the greater burden in this situation to avoid a collision.
So at this point, the Davis Law Group you've got your whole team working on this. You've dug up the surveillance video. You figured out that the cyclist had been going too fast earlier on their ride. And you found out that the cyclist had insurance. So now begins the negotiating process. Am I right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we filed suit. Because with a lawsuit, I have subpoena power, which means I can ask for records. I can find out more information from the cyclist about his bike, his GPS system, and so forth. That was the first thing. Once we got the additional information, we were able to prove that he had been traveling in excess of the speed limit in other locations on the same trail. That really strengthened our case, along with the video that we found. Once we had all of the evidence, and once we hired some experts, medical experts, to assess her injuries, her long-term prognosis, then we were in a position to try to settle the claim.
And what was the defense saying? What was their point of attack on this?
Their primary argument was that our client, Tina, was responsible for what happened because she did not adequately look both ways before stepping out into the trail.
How much back and forth was there between you and the insurance company? Those can't be pleasant
No, it probably took 3 to 4 months of negotiation back and forth. The insurance company wanted more information. They wanted to do their investigation, so we allowed that. They wanted to hire their own medical experts to assess Tina's condition, review her records, and so forth before the insurance company was going to really start negotiating the claim. So about 4 months before we found out that the Cyclist had about $4.3 million in coverage, which is highly unusual. He had an umbrella policy in play that covered this type of incident, and so Tina was fairly lucky in that regard.
And what if he didn't have insurance? What would you have done then? If
he didn't have insurance, then there's really no source of recovery. There's not a lot that we can do. You could file a lawsuit against somebody, but if they don't have insurance, they don't have assets. Even if they do have assets, they can declare bankruptcy, push the case into bankruptcy, which can take another 2 to 4 years before there's resolution. So the fact that he had insurance was hugely important, of course. And that's one of the first things that we ask about when we file a lawsuit.
So how do you come up with a number then? Are you just going for the maximum amount of insurance that you can get, or are you looking at her costs and trying to figure out, how much they're worth?
All of the above. What we first look at is what are her damages, and what we wanted to know was, is this injury permanent? And if so, what sort of medical needs will she require over the length of her life? And so we hired an expert who put together what is called as a life care plan. And it itemizes every single modality of treatment that she is likely to need for that type of injury over the next 30, 40 years. The life care plan that we prepared showed that she was going to need at least $10 million to cover that care over the course of her life. Yeah, a lot. With that, $10 million, then that only covers her medical bills in the future. There are other damages, the loss of enjoyment of life, the disability, the impact, the intangibles that an injury can cause. And we felt that those damages were much higher than $10 million, given the extent of her injuries.
Wow. So even though the Davis Law Group gets this settlement, a sizable one, it still doesn't really scratch the surface of what the cost is to Tina and her family.
Yeah, and unfortunately we see that too often. One of the other unusual aspects of this case is that we were able also to get a personal contribution from the cyclist himself. So I believe he ponied up another $250,000 on top of the insurance. Wow. But that was a battle as well. So the cyclist had to hire his own personal counsel to advise him on that. We went to a mediation and so forth. There was a lot of back and forth on what amount he should pay out of his own pocket.
So this affects both lives, really, in a negative way.
Yes.
It's such an amazing story. And then how do you handle seeking personal contributions? So do you go to that person? You said he ended up ponying up $250,000. Do you come up with a number for him, and then he has to negotiate? Is that how it goes?
Yeah, so like I said before, we quantify our client's damages. We knew that she needed at least $10 million in future medical care. We looked at what insurance that he had. He only had about $4.3 million, so not nearly enough to cover her medical needs. We did some background investigation on the cyclist, found out that he had been an executive at a successful software company. We knew where he lived, whether there was any liens on the property and so forth. So we knew that he had money. The question was how much. We didn't know that. We couldn't get that information in the lawsuit that we filed against him for other reasons. But we made it known to the lawyer hired by the insurance company that we were going to ask for a personal contribution. Once that demand was made, then he hired his own personal counsel to advise him on that part of the case.
At any point, were you thinking about going after the city or the county? In other words, was the signage the way it was supposed to be? Was everything set up on that trail and that pathway the way it was supposed to be?
We certainly look at that. So we've handled many cases involving unsafe features of trailways against the county or the city. And they're very, very difficult cases to win because of the law that applies to this area, this type of trail. So we knew that the claim against the city or the county was very weak. However, it didn't stop the cyclist's attorney from trying to argue that they were also responsible. And we knew that there was no way that we could make that case because of the laws that applied in this case.
You know, Chris, so many of us walk these trails and we ride bikes on these trails. What's a takeaway that the average person out there can take from this situation moving forward?
I think what I would say is, a lot of us use the trails. A lot of us are cyclists, but we also use the trails as pedestrians. Both cyclists and pedestrians have an obligation to be safe, to avoid collisions. The cyclist has usually a little bit more of a burden because they're the ones that are going fast. They're the ones that can spot where pedestrians are and can avoid or yield to pedestrians. But if you're a pedestrian on the trail, you've got to be very, very careful because sometimes you'll have cyclists that are not following the rules or going too fast. And, your life can change in a moment, just like what happened to Tina. Yeah,
2 lives there. And how rare are these situations, these cyclist pedestrian accidents?
They're fairly common. Most of them don't involve injuries or they're near misses. I would say probably less than 20-25% involves serious injuries, probably even less than that. When it comes to serious injuries, however, if you're injured by a cyclist, one of the first things you should do is to hire an attorney so that an investigation can be performed immediately. For instance, getting surveillance footage from nearby homeowners, because that evidence is typically lost after a certain period of time, sometimes as short as 30 days. But that evidence can make or break a case. And so in Tina's case, fortunately, we were able to get that video, which really strengthened her case.
Sounds like the Davis Law Group really did a great job on this case. Fascinating case that I think we can all learn from. We all certainly hope that Tina and her family are doing as well as possible. I'm Eric Johnson. This is Chris Davis, founder of the Davis Law Group, and this is the latest episode of the True Claims Podcast. We'll see you next time. Eric Johnson here. I spent the last 30 years reporting on what you need to know, and now I've got something I think everyone could use. The Washington Accident Book Series offers a free legal guidebook on everything from car crashes to dog bites, so that you know what to expect after any kind of accident. Know your rights and how to avoid common mistakes after an accident by getting your free copy at WashingtonAccidentBooks.com.